Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and the Stronghold is so much more than just a YouTube channel. But make no mistake about it, unlike Gandalf, I am in fact a conjurer of cheap tricks. Because be it decks for any format, set reviews, or economy hacks, budget is what we do here. Because at the end of the day, whether it's free to play resources, cold hard cash, or just time, we're all limited in some way, and that makes us all budget players. So please take a moment to like, comment, subscribe, and share across all of our many platforms, and that will allow us to be stronger together as a community. All right, so today we are going to be talking about one of the most notorious parts of Magic the Gathering's Arena client, and that is the hand smoothing algorithm, often referred to as the shuffler. Occasionally you see people arguing back and forth on the internet, as people do, about whether this exists or it doesn't. And really, I don't get that, because the folks at Wizards of the Coast, the folks that program Arena, have stated unequivocally that they do in fact use a hand smoothing algorithm for best of one matches, and the intent is to reduce the number of, and I quote, extreme opening hands. And the example that they tend to give is opening hands with 0 or, on the other end, 7 lands. Obviously, neither of those is very good, and in order to improve the play experience, they use a hand smoothing algorithm to eliminate or greatly reduce those effects. And of course, its existence isn't really the only thing that people fuss about on the internet. One of the most common phrases that you see in any Magic the Gathering Arena social media client is that the shuffler is broken. And in fact, people will get downright angry and accusatory in this area. And, well, it might not be as broken as you think it is. Now, there are definitely some issues with using some sort of synthetic shuffler algorithm. For instance, the algorithm is not at all transparent. Wizards of the Coast has not released any details about how it works from a programming standpoint or a statistical standpoint. So players really don't have a basis to understand how it affects their chances of winning. And of course, when you get a bad beat, for some people psychologically, it's easier to blame the shuffler than to admit that maybe you made a play error, or maybe you don't fully understand deck building, all of which we want to try and address here as a community. The algorithm can be gamed. Players who are more familiar with how it works can build decks to make it work to their advantage, and are more likely to produce a favorable hand for that deck. And really, that's the goal of what we're going to do in this series of videos, is get a better understanding of how it works so that we can in fact game it. A few years back, there was a semi-famous incident of this on what a lot of people now refer to as the 1.0 shuffler algorithm, where you could actually make mono red decks with like 12 lands, and they actually worked really, really well, something that would never happen in actual paper Magic. And of course, the pros somewhat discovered this just out of a sheer number of games, and it actually stayed kind of a secret tech for about 6 months. And then the secret got out and everybody was outraged. And eventually it appears that Wizards has taken steps to address some of those issues, and now we're on a second or third iteration of the hand smoothing algorithm. Additionally, algorithms in general can make games less skill intensive. Players don't really have to worry as much about mana screw or mana flood, so a lot of janky piles get by. It's only when those janky piles stop working that people really take a negative notice of the shuffler, because it's not doing as much as they're used to it doing. As cards are inherently physical things, the act of shuffling a deck is inherently physical. So getting a computer to do this in a digital construct is actually a lot trickier than what you might think. Luckily for us, I had just enough interest in the computer sciences back in the day to develop a reasonable understanding of how these things work. I don't code for a living or anything like that, but enough knowledge to explain this to the non-computer science people of the world so they can have a better idea of how these things work. Algorithm is just a fancy computer science way of saying a set of instructions, i.e. code, for solving a particular problem or accomplishing a particular task. Most generally, an algorithm takes a series of inputs, runs it through a process, and spits out an output. When it comes to electronically shuffling digital cards, there's really two dominant methods at work in the industry. The first is the Fisher-Yates shuffle. This is what we refer to as a deterministic shuffling algorithm because if you understand enough about how it works, you can exactly predict the outcome, which is kind of not what you want in something like a game or some sort of gambling scenario. You don't want people to know exactly what's going to happen. The Fisher-Yates shuffle generates a random number and takes the card that has that corresponding number and places it at the back of the deck. Then it repeats this process until all the cards have been shuffled. Of course, if you know how that random number is generated, you can exactly predict how the deck has been shuffled. You can also create a recursive algorithm that if you know what the starting deck looks like, you can find through the first 3 or 4 cards and then understand exactly what all the other cards are going to be throughout the remainder of the deck. This is way deeper computer science than what we're going to get into, but this is basically why computers and electronic methods are not permitted in casinos. Human beings can count cards if they want to, but you're not allowed to use machines because they're just too darn good at it. Banana shuffle is the second method, and it's a somewhat humorous name. And honestly, I wish I had some humorous anecdote about why it's called that, but honestly, I don't know. It's a more complex shuffling algorithm. It's the one that people prefer to use if at all possible. What you do is your predetermined pile of cards is split evenly into 2 stacks of predetermined point. That initial pile was, of course, randomly determined. It wasn't in any sort of order. Then each pile is ordered according to some sort of rank profile. For the purposes of Arena, that could be something like lands and non-lands. It could be CMC. It could be the card number within the particular set. We don't really know what could be or what is used, but there's a lot of things that could be used. Each of those individual piles are then sorted according to that predetermined ranking attribute, and then the 2 piles are interlaced, taking 1 card from each stack until both stacks are gone, and have assembled a third final shuffled deck. Nearly any method or conglomeration of methods uses a random number generator to some degree. And here's the bad news, kids. Computers don't have an imagination. They can't actually create a random number. A random number generation in and of itself is another form of an algorithm in order to do its best impression of having randomly pulled this number out of thin air. While there are many ways to get a computer to perform this particular trick, they basically fall into 2 groupings. The first of which is a pseudo-random algorithm. This appears to generate random numbers, but it's actually quite deterministic. It starts with a seed number. It can be any number, but it's generated from a random source, such as a mouse movement, a keyboard input, or more often than not, a function of the computer's internal clock. The algorithm then uses the seed to calculate the next number in the sequence, using mathematical functions that are often designed to be difficult to reverse engineer. Then it repeats step 2 until it has fulfilled the requested number of random numbers that we wanted. And whether that is 52 for a standard playing card deck or 60 plus for a standard Magic deck, it just goes through that step as many times as it needs to. On the upper end of the complexity scale for random number generation, we have true random functionalities. These are based on unpredictable physical phenomenons referred to as an entropy source. And they're designed to be generating numbers that are not deterministic and are not easy to decompile or be able to predict. Some of the examples for entropy sources would be quantum thermal or shot noise, a concept of jitter, which is about the timing and movement of electrons within a signal. You have chaos, which is an unpredictable behavior of nonlinear systems. And of course, there are also forms of human input. We talked about mouse movements and keyboard strokes previously. Those are more often than not considered too defined and limited number of options to be really used for a true random source. Instead, human input here is more often reserved for complex biometric inputs. Say a point on a retinal eye scan, the average curvature of a biometric fingerprint scan, even something like pulse or oxygenation rate of blood at any given moment. Any of those things would be almost impossible to predict with any kind of certainty, much less than decompile the random code back into a successful algorithm to be understood by a person outside of the system. And just in case that wasn't complicated enough, the reality is that most random number generation systems actually use a combination of the two pseudo and true random generation techniques. For instance, Microsoft, what may be the largest software producer on the planet, I do believe, they use, I believe this is pronounced Maricine twister algorithm for the pseudo-random side. It's a seeded combination of system entropy and user input. Data is considered to be unpredictable, etc., etc. For the true random number generation, it uses a special instruction of its own design, commonly referred to as RD-RAND. That is something that even like spreadsheet users may be familiar with that. This instructs the CPU to generate a random number from physical sources that could be anything like atmospheric or thermal noise. And it's used in conjunction with the previously mentioned PRG to generate a random number for the Windows system. And to make matters even more interesting for programmers of something like Arena, each individual processor, hardware, operating system, they all use slightly different combinations of the PRNG and TRNG to generate random numbers. The long story short here is that on a system like Arena, the shuffler or any other algorithm which is almost inherently reliant on random numbers may perform slightly differently depending upon the hardware and operating system combination which you are running it on. All right, so we have talked about within this video that Arena Wizards of the Coast has not been particularly transparent about this. And frankly, that's not at all unexpected when it comes to software development. They're just like magicians. If you know how the trick works, We don't really need them anymore to do it. But we do have some information about what it is that they are doing to accomplish this. So let's take a look at that as we move forward. And the faces behind Arena have told us some, well, fairly generalized ideas of exactly how the hand smoothing algorithm, aka the shuffler, does in fact work. We have been told point blank that it works by creating two copies of your deck, shuffling each one separately and independently, and then selecting the copy which gives you the opening hand closest to your average land count. If for some reason both hands generated have the same land count or are equidistant from your true average, the algorithm then again randomly selects one and presents it to you as your deck and opening hand. From that and some very large constructs and data samples, we have been able to infer that the algorithm does in fact look at the number of lands in your deck, and more specifically, the ratio of land to non-land within your deck. It also appears to look at the average mana costs of your deck so that it can give you the right number of land to be able to cast your average spells. And furthermore, it looks at the color distribution of the lands within your deck and more than likely compares that land distribution to the mana pip distribution of the cards within your deck. We spoke earlier about how an algorithm essentially takes input, runs it through a process, and spits out an output. And by further understanding how these things work, we can predict the output and adjust our input in order to get a more ideal output. This is what we talk about when we try and game the shuffler. Now, of course, we have total control over the input, but not necessarily total understanding of it. So let's focus first on the output, since Wizards of the Coast has been so kind as to tell us exactly what it is that they're trying to accomplish. And ultimately, what they're trying to accomplish is a fun gaming scenario. Nobody wants to have mana screw or mana flood. Nobody wants to have a bunch of cards in their hand that they can't cast. So based on this and what they have very specifically told us and what we can infer, we can theorize that an ideal hand on Arena is going to look like approximately 2.8 lands. Obviously, you can't draw a 0.8 of a land, so more often than not, the hand smoothing algorithm is going to trend towards 3 lands. We can also infer, so that you can actually enjoy the game, that most of the cards in your opening hand are going to be on the lower portions of your curve, with the idea being that you draw into the higher values and additional lands as the game progresses. By understanding what Wizards of the Coast and the Arena programmers' idea of an ideal output is, we can then start to design our decks to provide an ideal input for the algorithm to work with and give us the outcome that ultimately we want. And to kind of wrap our heads around what that ideal input is, we really don't have to look any further than the starter decks designed by Wizards of the Coast themselves to give ideal play experience, particularly to new players. If we look at On the Hunt, for instance, and really you can pull up any of these whatsoever, but you're going to see some very normal trends here in the lands. If we pull up the ratios here, you're going to see numbers in that 23, 24, 25 range for the lands. That puts you right around that 40% land density, or that 2.8 expected opening lands in your opening hand. By going up to 25, you actually end up getting like 2.84 something. Can't do the math in my head right this minute, but you move just a little bit closer to that 3 lands in the opening hand. Additionally, if we look at how the land is made up, you'll see that every single one of these decks by design is 2 colors. So you've only got 2 colors of mana producing land. And aside from the basics, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 non-basic mana producing lands. This is more or less the expectation that Arena's hand smoothing algorithm is designed for. So if you're having problems with decks that are trying to run 3 and 4 colors, now you know why. You're not meeting the expectation that the hand smoothing algorithm is designed for. If you've got a bunch of single individual lands, like a one-of copy of this, that, and another, and all of a sudden your non-basics are like 7 or 8, you are further confusing the hand smoothing algorithm that is trying to give you a good opening hand. And unfortunately, this is something that happens a lot within Arena because we run the lands that we have. We don't necessarily spend wild cards to have 4 copies of this and 4 copies of that. We run a bunch of one-ofs because that's what we ended up having. And a lot of times it's better to drop some of those things, like tempo lands, for instance, and just run more basics in order to get those smoother opening hands and less flood or mana screw in your later draws of the game. And by having better understanding of how all of the algorithm works and what it's trying to accomplish, we have a better chance at being able to game the algorithm to get the sort of hands that we want, even when we do things that are very much off the reservation. For instance, one of my favorite combinations here is treasure hunt decks that, as you can see, run well over 40% land. But by understanding how the algorithm is churning through these things and adjusting certain quantities and outcomes, we can still ensure that we get the correct card in our opening hand more often than not. Similarly, but on the opposite end of the spectrum, you can design something like Charbelcher, which does not contain a single land in it whatsoever. By traditional definitions, it's all dual-sided. And yet we can make a deck like this that runs far outside of expectations and still runs smoothly and fairly reliably for such an oddball design. And in an upcoming video, we're going to talk specifically about building the mana curve and land ratios for your deck, specifically to game for specific outcomes from the hand smoothing algorithm, so that we can collectively, as a community and as a culture, stop complaining about things like mana flood and mana screw, and stop screaming at the top of our lungs like conspiracy theorists that the shuffler is broken. But for now, we can all sit back and rest assured that the shuffler is not in fact broken, and it does treat everyone effectively the same. It has nothing to do with how much money you spend on Arena or any of those other conspiracy theories that will abound out there in the wilds of social media space. We can all stand to be a little bit more proactive and better deck builders, myself included, so that we can learn how to get the output, the outcome that we want by building our decks in certain ways. And folks, before you go, make sure you've subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on a thing. Because I know I can't change the Magic economy all by myself, but I think we can.